Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault, by Ari Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and last time, death and war finally confronted Hadrimon and Belisatra, only to have their epic confrontation rudely interrupted by a whole bunch of demons who just randomly showed up through a hole in the air, and who very, very quickly came to regret that decision. Now, we continue the story with Chapter 18. Most of the surviving demons fled screaming back through the portal, which slipped shut behind them with an almost obscene slurping. The few who remained, either too stupid, too arrogant, or simply too slow to escape with the others, fell swiftly and without much difficulty to Harvester and Chaos Eater. Spattered with gore, their boots squelching wetly with every step, the horsemen examined the carnage. Neither could help but notice, almost immediately, which particular bodies were not present. "Belisatra?" War asked. "Hadrimon?" "Lost track of them in the battle," Death admitted disgustedly. "You?" "The same. I imagine they ran as soon as our backs were turned." Death proceeded slowly to the chamber's center, and leaned heavily over the work table, his weight resting on his knuckles. Had any enemies still been present, they'd have died swiftly, painfully, bloodily in that moment. There were none, however, and smashing the furniture, though perhaps satisfying, wasn't his style. "All right," he said finally, drawing a ragged breath. "They've escaped us. We've wasted an opportunity, but it won't be our last." War grunted something non-committal, then said, "Hadrimon and Belisatra seemed just as surprised by the demons as we were. It would appear that word of the Abomination Vault is starting to spread." The older brother ran his hand through a bit of the gore that had sprayed across the table, examined it between his forefinger and thumb. "It was inevitable, I suppose. And there'll just be more of them the longer this takes us." He shook the goo from his hand with a flick of the wrist. "So which Lord of Hell did they serve? I'd have thought that Samael was the most likely to figure out what we were doing. But this was awfully overt for one of his—" "Don't assume," War interrupted, "that our new enemy is necessarily a demon." "Oh, of course, how foolish of me. What evidence could I possibly have based that on?" War's smile was utterly lacking in mirth. "You've been gone a long time, Death." "So everyone keeps reminding me. What of it?" "So a few things have changed in those centuries. One of which was, people took notice of the fact that the Nephilim's greatest defeat, before Eden, of course, was at Kothysos." Death began to speak, paused, began once more. "The demons only agreed to fight for the old ones at Kothysos because they believed that we were a common enemy. Since then, a number of Hell's smaller factions have hired themselves out to anyone who can offer them sufficient payment, in weapons, souls, slaves, what have you." "Demonic mercenaries? Who's foolish enough to trust demons?" War shrugged. "I don't imagine anyone really trusts them, but when all they need are soldiers." "In essence, then, you're suggesting that these demons could be working for anyone or anything." Death shook his head. "And here I'd just been thinking that this whole affair had been far too simple and straightforward up until now. Can you question any of them, brother?" Death nodded slowly. "Not immediately. I need some time to gather my strength and to heal. Soon, though. In the interim, a bit of searching wouldn't be wasted time, I think. We might just turn up some hint of where Hadrimon and Belisatra have gone. And by the way," he'd raised his voice, clearly no longer addressing his brother, "you can come out now." Dust plunged from the highest passageway to alight upon Harvester. Feathers puffed proudly erect and head held high, as though he himself had repulsed the demon horde. War chuckled softly. "Don't encourage him," Death demanded. Their first discovery was interesting, though not immediately helpful. Various deep gouges on the floor and the walls, older and of a very different texture from those caused by Death's storm of bones, suggested that something of truly prodigious size had recently occupied the workshop. In fact, considering the marks on all sides of the room and on gantries and bridges of various heights, it might actually have taken up almost the entirety of the workshop. "One of the Grand Abominations?" War asked. "I certainly hope not. I remember a few of the devices that were that big, and I dislike the idea of Belisatra and Hadrimon having access to any of them. Either way, we can be sure of one thing." "Belisatra has the means to create some truly gargantuan portals." Death waved vaguely at the various passageways. "There's no door here large enough for something that size to pass through." Then, after briefly tapping a finger against a blank expanse of mask, he continued, "We need to speed this up. You keep searching here. I'm going to take a look at the side chambers." Death's examinations carried him through myriad winding corridors. All were carved through the living rock. A few had been further reinforced with iron bands and bracing. The rooms to which they led varied in size, though none was nearly so large as the central laboratory. Some were simple storerooms containing tools or raw materials, mostly stone and brass. Mostly, but not all. Some held, instead, the remains of bodies, strips of flesh, cords of muscle, ropes of sinew, piles of bone. All were notched, torn, or misshapen, as though someone had been attempting to construct something out of them. Most, to judge by the damage and the pattern of stained blood, had been removed while their prior owners were still alive. A couple of the other rooms were austere sleeping chambers, boasting only bedrolls and a few simple amenities. One, the largest of these side chambers, contained a machine of dark steel, with dozens of rotating gears, sliding shelves, pistons, and tubes. Death couldn't begin to guess at its purpose, until he finally found a few scraps of brass lying atop a conveyor belt. He theorized then that this was a device designed to accelerate Belisatra's work, enabling her to create her constructs far more rapidly than she might with only hand tools and a forge. If so, it explained how she'd created such vast armies of artificial soldiers, but it still didn't bring Death any nearer to determining where they might have gone. He was struggling ever more fiercely to keep his frustration in check as he grudgingly made his way back towards the central chamber. If War hadn't found something, anything, their search might just have come to an abrupt dead end after all. He needn't have worried. Entering the laboratory, Death saw something lying atop the work table, something coated in blood and gore, something that most assuredly had not been there when he'd departed. "I found it under one of the dead Phantom Guards," War said without preamble. "I believe it's the object Belisatra was studying when we arrived. It must have gotten knocked off when the battle started. She either didn't see where it had fallen, or lacked the time to recover it." He flashed another humorless grin. "I picked it up with a tip of Chaos Eater. If it's what I suspect it is, I'm not foolish enough to touch it until I know more about it." His frustration slowly eroding away beneath a growing current of curiosity, Death approached the table. It couldn't be one of them. He'd have felt its presence from the moment he entered, just as he had that of Black Mercy, and yet... Beneath the caked ooze, he saw what appeared to be a small buckler shield with an integrated gauntlet. He brushed his hand across it several times, scarcely touching it, until he'd wiped away some of the grime. It consisted primarily of old, discolored bone, though the joints on the fingers were a mesh of chain steel. The buckler itself appeared to be made up of an elongated face. The jaw, which gaped open just above the wrist of the gauntlet, sported an array of fearsome teeth, while the remainder of the shield was rimmed in jagged horns. A single enormous eye protruded just above that yawning mouth. "Mortis," he whispered. "It's one of them, then?" War asked. Then, when Death nodded, "I sensed something in the air, just before Hadrimon pulled that pistol." "Black mercy," Death told him. "All right, but I don't feel that here." Death leaned in until his face was nearly touching the vile thing, almost as though he were sniffing at it. "I think," he said slowly, "it may be dead." "Dead?" "I told you, the Grand Abominations are living things, albeit in a way we can barely recognize. It's that awareness, that malevolence that we feel in their presence, at least as much as it is their raw power. But here..." Again, he ran his fingertips over the gauntlet, never quite touching it. "There's some energy left, but it's minuscule. Mortis might still function at the slightest fraction of its former strength, but I'm not detecting anything of life." War, too, leaned over the peculiar object, though not so close as Death. "I hadn't realized that any of the abominations were defensive in nature." "It's not, really. Yes, it's a shield, but its purpose was never to protect the wearer. At least, not directly." "Then..." Death straightened, his eyes focused on the far wall rather than anywhere near his brother. "When awakened and at full strength," he said, his voice grim, "Mortis reacted to any attack on the wearer by sending out a concentrated burst of profane energies. It was incredibly swift, capable of traversing an entire world in a matter of heartbeats." "And its target?" War asked when his brother seemed disinclined to continue. "A random friend, family member, or other loved one plucked from the strongest memories and emotions of the attacker." Now he did turn towards his younger brother, who glared at him through a mask of horrified revulsion. "Even at the height of our depredations," Death told him, "most of you knew barely half of what we of the Firstborn were doing. So I'm starting to understand. It's who we were at the time. It's unfortunate, but I make no excuses." Death lifted Mortis from the tabletop. "I doubt Belisatra can do much with it, but leaving it here would just be asking for trouble. I'll hold on to it until we can..." Had Death been mistaken? Was there a sliver of awareness remaining in Mortis, so flimsy and buried so deeply that he'd failed to sense it? Or was it, perhaps, some residual instinct? A hyper-sophisticated version of an insect's continued running and twitching after being crushed. The horseman had no way of knowing, nor did it particularly matter. He felt a surge from deep within Mortis, a white, searing agony that crackled across every nerve, finger to arm to shoulder to mind. A rigid, iron will that might well have kept the alien semi-sentience at bay, if it had been even remotely prepared, was instead swept aside by the tide of psychic fire. Emotions and defenses burned and scattered. A brilliant illumination rippled across his soul, casting the dark shadow of memories upon the walls of his mind. Death stumbled, almost collapsing to his knees, as Mortis began to know. Worlds away, in a realm where day and night were measured in centuries, and the seasons in eons, 1,000 clanks and clatters echoed from the depths of a glacial cave. What had only ever been intended to serve as a temporary staging area, an isolated grotto large enough for the gathering of hundreds or even thousands of soldiers, as well as several devices far, far larger, was now the primary headquarters of a desperate angel and his seemingly soulless ally. Uninterested in whatever mechanical adjustments and improvements Belisatra might be making to her countless constructs, or the moribund abominations, Hadrimon paced the cramped confines of a small side cavern. No, paced was insufficient. He marched, stomped, each stride a separate expression of impatient wrath. permafrost cracked beneath his heels. Slivers of icicle fell at every step. Wings furled and stretched in irregular twitches. Wrists and fingers spasmed as though wrapped tight about some hated throat. The glistening whites and gritty grays of the cave were tinged with crimson, and the angel was too overwrought to tell that this was no mere illusion cast by the hatred enshrouding his brain. His vision truly was obscured, for Hadrimon was weeping blood. How had the Council's hounds found them? Nobody should have known of Lilith's abandoned laboratory. Had Belisatra deceived him? Had she told someone of their sanctum? Planned this? Betrayed him? Perhaps he should... It wasn't until he actually heard the hollow click of tensing hammers and rotating chambers that Hadrimon realized he'd drawn Black Mercy, was cradling it almost sensuously in his palm as he stalked towards the cave mouth. No. His arm trembled as he forced the pistol back into the holster at his side. Belisatra's not the enemy. Remember the enemy. Remember the plan. Remember her, if nothing else. He needed to maintain control. Hadrimon screamed, tumbling to his hands and knees, wings flailing in uncoordinated sweeps as his mind abruptly burned. A white-hot lance, a chewing parasite, a nightmare with claws and doubts with fangs. All these burrowed through his thoughts and seared his soul. But they carried with them the thoughts of another, the deepest knowledge, the answer to everything he sought. Through his agony, through the bloody tears that smeared his cheeks and dribbled across his lips, Hadrimon began to laugh. Belisatra was not, in fact, working on her mechanized warriors at just that moment. Instead, she too occupied one of the caverns branching from the primary grotto. Unlike the relatively diminutive cave in which Hadrimon paced, however, this one was only moderately smaller than the vast chamber in which the brass and stone army awaited her command. She was not alone in this cave, not entirely. Not yet. Hanging in chains from the pitted walls, almost 24 figures decorated the periphery of the chamber. Some were angels, some old ones, a couple demons. Most were dead. The others wished they were, if they remained sentient enough to wish for anything at all. None retained more than 1/3 of their skin or half their muscles, for these had proved raw materials for Belisatra's so far unsuccessful experiments in awakening the Abominations. No screams, whimpers, or cries emerged from these broken, pitiful bodies. Tongues and vocal cords had been the first pieces removed, lest they disturb the Maker's concentration. The only source of light was a crystal sphere glowing with a pure white radiance. It hung in the air above her, supported by absolutely nothing at all, shedding a column of illumination that allowed Belisatra to see what she was doing, while keeping the remainder of the cave in cloaking shadow. And something waited within those shadows, something enormous, something she could sense looming over her even in the darkness. In her hands, Belisatra cradled what might at first glance have been a rifle. It consisted primarily of a perfect tube, carved from the femur of some lumbering giant. Both the handle near the rear of the weapon and the secondary grip further up the barrel were made of humanoid hands. The first was joined with the bone along the top, where the thumb should have been, so that the wielder's fingers would interlace with the handle's own. The second had its fingers wrapped about the barrel, providing a simple bit of cushioning and texture for the wielder's offhand. A faceted lens of blackest obsidian filled the tip of the barrel, and an impossibly long rope of braided hair trailed from the rear of the weapon, linking it to whatever it was that lurked unseen in the depths of the cave. The Maker had spent less time in contact with any of the Grand Abominations than had Hadrimon, and she certainly had a much tighter grasp on her emotions. Thus far, then, she'd experienced only the faintest inklings of the seething hatred and endless bloodlust that had begun to consume her companion. And thus, when the surge came, it struck her with a much weaker intensity. Belisatra rocked on her heels, shoved with an almost physical force by the unexpected pain. It was fearsome, piercing, yet it was nothing compared with the understanding that came with it. The corner of her broad, unfinished lips quirked in a shallow smile as she dropped the weapon and strode from the cave, searching for Hadrimon as rapidly as dignity would permit. With a cry of frustration and fury, Death hurled Mortis from him as though it had begun to bite. It smacked into the far wall, where it sent a cascade of stone chips and dried blood floorward, before it followed them to land with a hollow clatter. "Damn it!" The skin of the horseman's palms split and tore beneath his fingers, so tightly were they clenched. Had he any blood to shed, it would have poured in torrents. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" "Brother!" War took a single tentative step, almost but not quite reaching out. "What?" "I should have anticipated that!" Death, normally so unflappable, at least on the surface, was as distraught as War had ever seen him. "How could I be that stupid?" "What?" the younger rider tried again. "We have to go." "I thought you planned to question." "We have to go now! The council must be informed, and we have preparations to make. With any luck, it should at least take them some time before they can move. If we..." War's gauntleted hands closed on the other's shoulders, physically spinning him around. "What's happened, damn you?" Death froze in the midst of raising his own hands to knock his brothers away, then allowed himself, however slightly, to slump. "They know, War. Something, some vestige of Mortis's mind, still lingered, still communed with the others, and I didn't prepare myself for it. The Abominations tore the knowledge from me, and I've no doubt that Hadrimon and Belisatra now have it as well." "What knowledge?" War asked the question, but they both knew full well how Death would answer. "All of it. The history of the devices, the location of the Abomination Vault, and the means to fully awaken the damn things." And on that profoundly ominous note, that will bring us to the end of Chapter 18. That's a hell of a wrench in your plans, I would have to say. And I must say, between angry Death and panicked War there at the end, that was really harsh on my throat. Maybe they'll be calmer in the next chapter. Somehow I doubt it. But either way, I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, The Abomination Vault by Ari Marmel. Till then, have yourselves a great day. Later!